Professor Tedder, this afternoon I'm going to be asking you about the development of the test for HIV and then its introduction into the transfusion service. Before I do that, can I ask you to just tell us what the difference is between an RIA and an ELISA in terms of the two assays?
Right. The only difference, there is actually no difference between an RIA and an EIA per se, because the components of the test are the same, but the only difference is that the readout in a radioimmunoassay is radioactivity, and the readout in an EIA is colorimetric. And in fact, some EIAs are very much more like RIAs because the generation system actually generates photons. So you measure a signal as you would with radioactivity, which is measuring radiation. In some EIAs, you measure photon emission. The simple EIA is a system where it changes color, but the more modern ones actually generate photons. So it's just the signaling is different.
May I ask if
Sure.
the difference is essentially in the label which is attached?
It is the label is radioactive in one, and you measure gamma radiation, and the other it's colorimetric, and you measure the color. Essentially, that. Although those are the simple two extremes. There are some forms of EIA which actually measure photon emission, which is very similar as making
Yes.
gamma emission. So they can meet in the middle.
Yes.
So.
Now, you, in the early 1980s, were working on the development of an HTLV1 screening test, and that was how you first came into contact with Professor Weiss. Is that right?
Yes, it would be, because I wanted to have a serological test. Therefore, I needed to have an antigen, that's a protein from the virus, and I didn't have the facilities to grow that virus because we needed strict containment, and I got into serious trouble at once because something wasn't contained as it should have been, and I needed the virological proteins, therefore I liaised with Robin Weiss.
And you describe in your statement the nature of the assay that you developed, and you use these terms. It was a one-step, simultaneous, competitive assay. Can you just help us understand what that is?
Right. This is where you really need a board. Okay. Here we have a piece of plastic, which is on this side it's solid, and there's a hole in here. And this would be known as a microtiter well, and it's round, so you can put liquid in here and it's constrained by the plastic. On the plastic, we have a protein. This is the protein stuck on the plastic. If I'm making what I call a competitive EIA, here's the protein, here's the label that wants to get on there. So if I ask somebody to come up and block this, they will put their hand on there. Do you want to do this?
No, I think if you just talk us through it, it's easy. Otherwise, the microphone doesn't pick me up.
Okay. There is the solid phase with the protein on it. Here's a label which is going onto there. If somebody else wants to get on there first, or is stronger than getting on this, they block this from going on there. And if that is an antibody that's going on there and it's stronger than this can't get on there, so you lose the signal. So you get a direct competition. You go from generating a signal to completely losing the signal. And that's because of competition. So do people follow that principle? So it's a competition binding onto there, and it's blocked by an antibody. That is what I call a competitive immunoassay.
And you've explained in your statement and I think produced a slide that there are a range of different assay formats, antibody assay formats. We'll just put it briefly on screen. It's
Yeah, please.
WITN 3436004.
I hope this is going to be the slide. Yes. Okay.
So the competitive assay, which you were just describing, is the type 3.
Yes, I mean, I would say, Mum, that I'm probably one of the few people who uses type 1, type 2, type 3, type 4. I use it because, as a serologist, it's easier to say. But basically, you can see in the type 3, you've got one incubation where you incubate the label antibody with the red star on it with an antibody with no star on it. And if there's a lot of antibody with no star, the antigen, the label doesn't bind and you get no signal. So you go from having a strong signal with the absence of antibody to no signal with the presence of antibody.
And you, again, explain in your statement that your view was that the competitive assay was the most effective.
I'm not sure that I would use the term effective. Can I just explore that for 30 seconds?
Yes, absolutely.
The advantage of the competitive assay is twofold. One is that you have to have, as you look at that slide, go across the bottom, the lower antibody is the competing antibody. It has to be an effective competition, otherwise you don't get a signal. And if you have sticky sera, which would give you non-specific signals in the type 1 assay, which is what manufacturers make, you would get a signal in the type 1 assay, but you got no signal in the competitive type 3 assay. And when you're dealing with something which is really a damaging infection, if you're telling somebody that you've got antibody, you're infected, you need to be certain, or you need to be as certain as you can of the specificity. Because if you get a reputation for having a bad test, nobody will come forward to be tested, and that's damaging to the environment, that's damaging to people. So I personally like the type 3 competitive assay, and I was working on HTLV1 and HTLV2 with a type 3 assay, and it was natural to do exactly the same for HIV and come up with what eventually became the Welkersheim assay.
We can take that down, thank you. So you
May I ask, the black Ys, horizontal Ys that we see there, they are the antibodies.
They are, sir.
The protein of interest is what the antigen that you suspect might be there, is it?
Yes, the protein, the target protein and the key is whatever virus you want is the protein that is specific to that virus or from that virus.
So when you've got the fluid which you're testing, which the sera, which contains may contain the protein of interest and may not. When it goes into the wells on the plate and the mixture of sera and is passed over it, the antibodies will bind to any antigen, any protein of interest in the wells. Is that the position? But if there isn't any antigen, they won't.
Broadly speaking, that is correct. The difficulty in the type 1 assay is if you take that target protein away, that's the top left-hand corner where it says first incubation, you've got the plastic, which is the sheared part, then you've got a face, and then you've got the viral protein. If you take that viral protein away in type 1 assays, you quite often find there is a significant antibody binding because the antibody sticks to the solid phase. This is particularly true in areas where you have other infections causing an agitation of the immune system. Malaria is the classic one, where type 1 assays are an absolute nightmare in malarial countries. And they found that currently with the assays for SARS-CoV-2. that there is so much non-specific stickiness, the assays are very non-specific. And that is the great advantage of the competitive test. You have to have an antibody of sufficient quantity and sufficient magnitude, which you frequently find in an infection, to block the specific binding of the label onto the antigen. And it gives you, it's a one-step assay. You put the two components into the well, you leave it for an hour, maybe an hour and a half, 2 hours, then you wash it and develop it. So you don't have a second incubation. So technically, in the laboratory, it's quite easy to do.
Thank you.
So you had used this type of assay to develop the test for HTLV1. You then used the same principles essentially to develop a test for HTLV2.
Can I take you back about 30 years?
Of course.
I developed the same protocol for hepatitis B, for core antibody and hepatitis B. And it was very easy having done that. So when a new virus came up, or any virus came up, we could make a competitive assay. I actually played with making one for cytomegalovirus antibody at one stage. And then when HTLV1 and HTLV2 came around, I made competitive assays for those. So when HIV or HTLV3 came around, it was a natural pathway to go down.
And so if we then go to your statement, WITN 3436003, page 56. You say this in the paragraph at the bottom of the page, and this is in relation then to HTLV3. The matter then became one of waiting for a suitable sample that could be used to develop a working HTLV3 test. So is it right to understand that once you had become aware of HTLV3, you understood or believed that it was a virus, you knew you had this methodology that you've described through the HTLV1, HTLV2 in your earlier work, was it the case that you realised fairly quickly that you might well be able to test for this using the competitive assay, and what you needed was then the sample in order to complete that process?
We needed, putting it in the terms that we had the antibody on the solid phase, we had our antibody which was labelled in the fluid phase, and we needed a supply. And when I say we needed, it was my laboratory for my research and my diagnostic work locally. I needed a supply of antigen that could go onto the solid phase and then act as a component for an assay. And in fact, the easiest way was to have an antibody on the solid phase, which would pull the antigen down, stabilize that, and then use that as a solid phase for the competitive assay. And it was, but from my point of view, I did not have the facilities in the very early stage to grow up a category 3 component in a safe laboratory without breaching health and safety regulations.
Now, in terms then of the wait for what you've described there as a suitable sample that could be used, I just want to try and clarify what happened, or what may have happened, in relation to the offer of a sample from Montagnier's team in Paris. And you put it in a handful of different ways in your statement. I don't mean that in a pejorative sense, Professor. I just want to look at what you say and then try and work out what happened in relation to that and when. So if we go, first of all, to paragraph 53, which is page 17. You talk about being aware of the work of Dr. Brun-Vézinet and Luc Montagnier, wished to derive a UK isolate. We asked for and were provided with a sample, although some difficulty was experienced with the initial delivery. I don't recall precisely when I became aware of their work, although I was aware of it when it was published. And you refer to meetings, including with Françoise Brun-Vézinet. So that's that first way in which you put it in your statement. Then paragraph 179, which is page 56, so the paragraph we were just looking at. You refer at the bottom of the page there to a sample from Montagnier going into transit but ending up being lost due to delays. And then finally in this statement, paragraph 459, which is page 138. You say in the third line, as far as I recall, the original sample of the virus from Paris was safely packaged and sent in the mail, but stayed in the post office over the weekend and the cells died. So just in relation to that first sample sent from Paris to the Chester Beatty laboratory, or Chester Beatty Institute, what is your best understanding of what happened and when?
It was dispatched by Luc Montagnier and his colleagues for Robin, and for some reason it got caught in the post office over the weekend and was not kept. I do not know whether it was live and wet at the time it was sent, or whether it was frozen and cryopreserved, ready to be revived when it came into Robin's laboratory. Either way, by the time it came into the laboratory, the cells were no longer viable.
And do you know roughly when that was? With autumn 83, or I think I've seen a reference somewhere, not necessarily from you.
Well, it would, without going into the paperwork or asking Robin, I don't know, but it was obviously very early on, because that was the cell culture from which he was going to deliver us a secure supply of what would have been LAV1 or LAV1.
I think Professor Weiss may say in his statement, he ascribes a date of October, I think.
It's either September or October. It's the autumn of 1983. That's right, sir. And then just, if we put up on screen a letter that was sent by Professor Weiss to the MRC in May 1984, JEVA 40148. And we can see the date, 11th of May. And then if we look at paragraphs 2 and 3 in this letter, so paragraph 2 refers to collaboration with medical virologists, in particular with you, Professor Tedder, and the development of radioimmunoassays described there as specific and sensitive for HTLV. And then Professor Weiss says, we already have Montagnier's isolate in our laboratory, and I hope to have collected Gallo's isolate by the time you received this letter. Now, Professor Weiss's statement indicates that what happened was a second sample was sent over from Montagnier in February 1984, which may explain then the reference to having Montagnier's isolate in the laboratory. Do you have any further knowledge of how Professor Weiss was able to confirm that he had the isolate from Montagnier by this date?
No, I don't, because although I worked closely with Robin and he was a friend and support on this, that was his area of activity, not mine, because as I say, we did not have at that stage the facilities for growing a category 3 pathogen.
And just for the benefit of the transcript, Professor Weiss's statement, we don't need to put it on screen at this stage, but it's WITN 6868 001. I don't have the paragraph number to hand, but he explains that a second sample was sent in February 84. Now, there's then reference there to awaiting for an isolate from Gallo, or expecting one at around this time. What's your recollection of how it was that you eventually...
I'm sorry to stop you there. We've got a technical hitch with the stenographers, so we just need to take a quick break to sort that out.
Oh, okay.
The reason I'm stopping you is because it's on the transcript. The transcript, therefore, has to record everything, and it's not doing it at the moment. I'm sorry about that, Professor. We'll take a 5-minute break.
Thank you.
Thank you for your patience. I understand that normal service is resumed.
It appears to be so, yes.
Well, let's try it and see.
Just to give the reference that I'd previously given, I referred to Professor Weiss's statement, and I found the paragraph number in the break. It's paragraph 320, where he says that the second sample from Montagnier was sent at the end of February 1984. If we just go back to your statement in any event, Professor Tedder, so WITN 3436003, page 57, you explain in the paragraph at the top of the page your recollection that the sample was derived from a cell line provided by Gallo, and then you refer to something called CBL1. We've got a statement from Professor Weiss, but just what can you just tell us what your recollection is of how it was you ended up ultimately with something you could use, and tell us what CBL1 is.
So from the time of receipt of a cell line through to having an antigen I could use for the culture. The first thing I had to do was to improve the security in the small laboratory which I had at the Middlesex Hospital Medical School, because we'd already had a rather unfortunate episode where from a ventilator, an exhaust should have went into a safety bottle and then out of the safety bottle. And the safety bottle had been left outside the category, the containment laboratory extraction platform. And that caused a significant amount of grief with the health and safety executive. But we worked around that and eventually agreed to have culture flasks in the laboratory, and we experimented on how to get the production of the antigen, and you're going to ask what antigen. I'll try and explain that in a minute, because we found out that if you had the cells growing uninfected in a big flask, and you inoculated them with the virus, that means so you put the virus in to infect that culture, and you kept the culture running for a few days, the turnover of the cells would produce into the fluid, but not into the cells, an antigen which we could absorb on the solid phase and then make a competitive antibody assay work very well. The road to this was to have a big flask with cells at a good density and ready to infect them. And this is what we asked our colleagues in Portland to do, and they actually elected to do it in a different way. They elected to take infected cells, put them in, and grow them up in a large quantity. And that did not give us the antigen we needed. There was something peculiar or something unique by having a lot of uninfected cells, pulsing the virus in, waiting a short time and taking the supernatant, as opposed to having a small number of infected cells and letting them grow up and take the supernatant. The first method worked, the second method didn't. And it's something to do with you encouraging rapid growth of cells to release virus envelope, which didn't happen if you expanded the cells from a small inoculum already infected. And that's why there was a difficulty in making the antigen, but we eventually got around that.
And are you able to say whether if you'd had access to a suitable sample from whatever source, Paris, US, developed by Professor Weiss, whatever source, if you'd had that in, say, summer or autumn of 1983, would that have meant you'd have been able to develop your test earlier than you did? Or were there other constraints?
Okay, can I just be careful of the word develop the test, because we had the test running on a small amount of virus grown up in small vessels to cover the amount of work that we wanted to do both in our GOM clinics and in the local health authority. So we were not constrained for doing the work that we wanted to do, the research and development work that we wanted to do. What we were not in the position to influence were those who wanted to grow this up to be able to supply a manufacturer with an antigen which they could use to make a manufactured version of our assay. And that was one of the difficulties that our colleagues in Portland had to rethink how they were going to grow the antigen. And when they elected to follow our protocol as having the cells grown up, infect the cells as a point in time and then harvest, then they could come up with an antigen which worked.
But if we just go back a little earlier to the point in time, I think you tell us in your statement, you had a working RIA that you could use for your purposes, and we'll look at the Lancet paper which shows how it was being used in a moment, but you had that working RIA by July 1984, or thereabouts, as I understand it. Would you have been able to get to that stage significantly earlier if you'd had the sample significantly earlier? Or is it impossible to say?
Well, I'm sure if it had been easier and quicker, we might have saved a few weeks. But at the end of the day, we needed to develop an understanding of how the assay worked, what its advantages were, what its disadvantages were, what its sensitivity was. And that's sensitivity in two senses. Sensitivity, if you have a population like this room and some people infected, how many of them could we detect? So that is, in clinical use, the sensitivity of the assay. And then, speaking as an old-fashioned virologist, I got 5 positive samples and I'm diluting them in negative plasma. How far can I detect them? That's the analytical sensitivity as opposed to the diagnostic sensitivity. And we had to work out both those parameters for the development of this assay.
Can we then look at the September 1984 Lancet publication, just to see where matters had got to by that stage? So it's NHBT 5068_015. We can see there the date, the 1st of September 1984. We can see the range of authors, and then if we look down towards the bottom of the page, if we just look at the summary, 2,000 persons in the UK were examined serologically for antibodies to HTLV3, sera reacting in a membrane immunofluorescence assay, IFA, to HTLV3, were also positive when tested against cells infected with LAV1, and cross-absorption tests indicated that these retroviruses are probably identical. A competitive radioimmunoassay, RIA, which was wholly concordant with IFA, was used to screen the sera. 30 out of 31 patients with the AIDS were seropositive, as were 89 patients with persistent generalized lymphadenopathy, PGL, 17% symptomless homosexual men, 34% haemophiliacs receiving pooled clotting factors, and 1.5% intravenous drug abusers. None of more than 1,000 unselected blood donors was seropositive. These data confirm the close association between HTLV3 and AIDS and PGL, and show that infection with HTLV3 is also prevalent in the populations in whom these syndromes are most likely to develop. So that's the summary. And then if we just go over the page, please. Under the heading Materials and Methods, we've got the first subheading Subjects, so we can see the groups who were tested. And so we've got patients with AIDS, patients with PGL, symptomatic homosexual patients, sexual contacts of AIDS patients, homosexuals at risk, heterosexual subjects recruited from GUM clinics, intravenous drug abusers being screened for hepatitis B, and then haemophiliacs undergoing regular clotting factor replacement therapy, sometimes with American commercial factor VIII concentrate, and then 1,000 unselected blood donors. The patients were drawn from the Middlesex, St Mary's and St Stephen's hospitals. Blood from groups 1 to 6 was collected between June 83 and July 84, and the sera stored. Sera from haemophiliacs have been collected since 1982. So just pausing there, in relation to the sera from haemophiliacs, do you have any knowledge as to where that came from, in the sense of which centres?
No, I don't, but these would have almost certainly come through collaboration with the haematology department at the Middlesex and their contacts. Not necessarily samples would have come from the Middlesex, but would have been generated by Professor Machin and other colleagues.
And I think we also see Dr. Krask as one of those named as involved, and it may have been samples through him as well. And then we've got the heading virus and cells. And then we're told HTLV 1, 2 and 3 kindly supplied by, and then we can see the reference there to the Gallo and colleague. And then LAV1 from Montagnier, Paris. And then HTLV3 was provided as a persistently infected cell line HT. So I think the first part of that is self-explanatory. Can you just tell us what that means? HTLV3 provided as a persistently infected cell line HT, clone H9.
Well, it's a particular type of cell line. The HT cell line would be a human T cell line, and clone 9 means it's somebody has selected derivatives from the master culture, and each derivative is called a clone. So it would be clone H9 of human T cells.
And then it continues that the LAV1 was provided as a cell-free culture supernatant, and so on. And then we have the heading IFA, so the Immunofluorescence Assay. I won't read it, but can you just tell us essentially what that refers to?
Okay. This comes back to a question from a chairman about methods of detecting antibody. And EIA, IA, immunofluorescence, or radioimmunoassay. This is actually using an immunofluorescent antibody directed against human IgG. So what you in this particular case, you've got a cell line growing on plastic. You've infected the cell line with in this case, HTLV3. So start again, they won't be already on the cell line, so you've got infected cells growing in, you've spread them onto a surface, you've let them dry on the surface, and you've stabilized them. So there's the plastic, here are the cells with the virus on it. So now you turn it down like this. So you've got the plastic surface, or whatever the surface is, and you've got the cells on there. Each of those cells is expressing HTLV3 because it's growing in those cells. You've fixed the cells, you've basically killed them, and you've dried them, and that is then a dried layer of cells which contain HTLV3 antigen. You then take your serum from somebody, known positive, known negative, you dilute it a little bit in buffered saline, and then you put it on there and you leave it for a period of time. And antibody, if there is antibody in there, will stick onto the antigen. You then wash it, and you say, okay, is there any IgG bound on that cell by putting in a fluorescent labeled antibody? So if there's antibody there, the fluorescent label comes on and sits on there. So when you hit it with ultraviolet light, it says, hey, I've got a bit of conjugate stuck on here. And when you actually do this, you can see the pattern of the conjugate sticking onto the infected cells.
And then if we go to the top of the next column, so same page but the right-hand side, we can see the heading. If we just zoom in a bit closer, thank you, Lawrence. Competitive radioimmunoassay for antibodies to HTLV3. And that's the assay you've been describing to us that you developed.
Well, the HTLV1 assay was a competitive,
yes.
Pull it down, come in, and then block it. And that's just saying, okay, we've done it with HTLV1, with HTLV2 here, we do it with HTLV3.
and that, again, I'm not going to read it out, but this article describes the process that was used in the assay. And then if we go to the bottom of the page, we've got the heading Results, Comparison of Tests. And if we pick it up in the second paragraph, sera which were reactive by IFA were all positive with RIA, and then further detail given. So can you then just explain the significance of that sentence?
It means that there was absolute concordance between calling samples positive or negative in the two different assays, by immunofluorescence or by competitive radioimmunoassay.
And then if we go to the next page, please, and we look first of all at table, that is the second table down on the left-hand side. So it's table 2, and so we've got the results there. AIDS patients 30 out of 31, etc. So that gives us the proportion with HTLV3 antibodies using these two tests. And we can see, amongst others, the haemophiliacs who have received pooled clotting factors, 63 out of 184, so 34%, had HTLV3 antibodies. And then if we just go to the discussion...
Just before you leave that, people may be noticing that only 30 out of 31 AIDS patients were antibody positive. The reason for that is you can get capsular sarcoma in people without having HIV. And I think the one seronegative patient was a young man with capsular sarcoma in the absence of HIV infection.
And then if we go to the bottom of this column and we have the heading discussion, there's this 2 simple, reliable and specific assays for the detection of antibodies to HTLV3 have been described. Findings obtained by competitive RIA shows complete concordance with those obtained by the membrane IFA, indicating that results obtained by the 2 assays are comparable and that the RIA detects antibody and not antigen. In addition, the assays indicate that HTLV3 and LAV1 are indistinguishable. And then there is a discussion, which I'm not going to read out, about the results by reference to each of the different cohorts of serum donor. So would it be right to understand the significance of what's described in this paper as being confirmation, first of all, that the assay that you had developed with Professor Weiss and colleagues worked in terms of detecting the virus that caused AIDS?
I think that's right. It's comforting that a competitive immunoassay worked as well as an indirect antibody assay.
And secondly, it indicated that HTLV3 and LAV1 were essentially the same thing.
In terms of acting as a solid phase for an immunoassay, yes, they were.
There's a second paper in the Lancet on that same date. I don't think we need to go to it.
Before we go there, may I just ask, because we started this discussion with a question about the timing of the test. This was a publication in the Lancet on the 1st of September. So presumably it must have been in press, submitted to the Lancet a little while before that. Am I right?
I wouldn't disagree, sir.
So either sometime in July or August it would have been submitted to the Lancet, and the tests which gave rise to it must therefore have been in use before that time. Does that help at all with roughly knowing when the testing was done of these 2,000 samples by the method you've described, in order for this article to be authored?
Well, Lancet is sometimes takes a little bit of time to make its mind up, so I would suspect this was submitted to Lancet in July, August, September, sometime June, July probably, and it's certainly July 84. Early part of July 84 is when we were quite certain that we had an assay which was sensitive and specific and stable and reproducible in the form of a competitive RIA, because we were, interestingly, the 4th of July was the time that we had a meeting coincidentally to say that we've got a good test, of course.
So if any point arises out of the dating of the first test thought to be reliable in the UK, it would be early to mid-July 84.
There would have been other tests available. I mean, people had the immunofluorescence assay. I'm sure our colleagues in Chester Beatty would have a virus neutralization assay. And we were just showing that we had a competitive immunoassay which fitted with the routine, if you can call it standard, indirect immunofluorescence assay.
So it's right then to say that various tests probably were available by mid-July 1984.
Yes.
Thank you.
And the second article in the Lancet, we don't need to go to, but just for the benefit of the transcript, PRSE 00002140. I just want to ask you then about an observation Professor Weiss makes in his statement. And so if we put Professor Weiss's statement on screen, Lawrence, it's WITN 6868001, and it should be page 25. And it is the bottom of the page. So this is in the context of a section of his statement in which he is discussing the Lancet article that we've just been looking at, Professor Tedder. And then he says this: in terms of the overall significance of these findings, our article included a larger data set on blood donors and on recipients' blood products than previously published reports from any country. Perhaps more important for this inquiry, the study revealed the actual rates of HI infection in North London for donors and for different risk groups for AIDS, and more broadly in the UK for patients with haemophilia. And then it's this sentence, really. The findings indicated the urgent need for screening to detect HIV infection, even though the infection rates in healthy donors was currently low. Would you agree with Professor Weiss's observation in that paragraph, but particularly in that last sentence?
Yes, ma'am. I don't think that necessarily is completely linked with the previous data that we were going over, which was a small subset. But yes, I mean, the data here would have been in association with our colleagues in the transfusion service. And
there had been, as I understand it from the Lancet article, the study that's written up in the Lancet article, or the results written up, include the 1,000 donors.
Yes, it included,
from North
yes.
London Transfusion
Yes, sure.
Service. So, but would you agree that it indicated the urgent need for screening to detect HIV infection?
well, yes, because what it's showing is however one addressed this, the virus was present in the United Kingdom population, and therefore, even though the prevalence of in healthy donors was currently very low, you couldn't say how long that was going to retain low, because once you've introduced an infectious agent into a population, if that agent is if the reproductive rate of that agent is greater than 1 person will beget 2 will beget 4, and you're off onto an expanding population. So the sooner you can control it, the better.
We can take that down, thank you. Now, an issue I've been asked to invite your observation on is this. Could the test that you've just been describing and that's described in the Lancet article, could it have been used to test plasma pool samples, for example from PFC or BPL, or batch samples of factor VIII concentrate?
Sorry, My hearing is not absolutely good. Could you say that
Of
last?
course. So could the test, the competitive radioimmunoassay,
Yes.
have been, in principle, used to test plasma pool samples, for example, from BPL, or batch samples of factor VIII concentrate?
Well, let's take it from the bottom first. Testing factor VIII concentrate would not necessarily have an adequate level of antibody in it to be valid in any assay. I mean, it will have some, but I don't know what level of dilution of sensitivity you would lose. In terms of testing individuals going into that batch, was that the first question?
No, the first part of it was testing plasma pool samples. So the actual, you've got the
Okay,
several
well then-
thousand donations already in the pool.
The same question applies. It could have been, but I don't know the sensitivity. Let's say you have a 1 in 500 donors was seropositive. You would have to say, would the test be adequately sensitive to always detect a 1 in 500 dilution in negative plasma of the positive? And frankly, I don't know at this time. The assay was good, but competitive assays probably are less sensitive in endpoint dilution from an antiglobulin assay. But I really don't know. It would have been interesting to do, and whether a negative would have been valid, which is what you need to prevent the onwards transmission into risk populations receiving that plasma, I don't know.
Now, if we go back to your statement, WITN 3436003, page 31, we can see from paragraph 92, so the bottom paragraph on the page, you say around this period, and you're answering by reference to a question about 1984-85, I was one of a group of people providing testing as requested by haemophilia centres or directors. This was particularly so because the competitive assay was such an accurate test and therefore was in great demand. And we'll look at some examples of documents, and in particular, I've got some questions to ask you about the testing of Professor Ludlam's patients. But in the autumn of 1984, going into the beginning of 1985, can you recall who else within the United Kingdom was providing testing?
Who else was?
Who else was providing testing?
CPHL, the Virus Reference Division at Colindale, would certainly have been.
And do you know what tests they would be using? Yours or something different?
I think we collaborated with Philip Mortimer, and he would have used at some stage the competitive RIA, and we helped him. I'm not sure if we helped him manufacture that or we sent him materials to build it. There would have been pressure to use the commercial assays, which I think would have been an Abbott antiglobulin assay, and I suspect there would have been an antiglobulin assay as well.
And then, other than Dr. Mortimer, do you recall who else? I'm particularly looking here at the autumn of 84 and the beginning of 85. Can you recall who else was, if anyone was providing testing facilities?
Frankly, with the best will in the world, no one. I'm sure there were, but I have no idea.
And then, if we go to HCDO 40270_007, it may indicate that.
Could I just make an observation on 92 before it disappears off?
Yes, could we?
We were approached by the Hemophilia Centre directors as a group to provide serological testing for them. So that doesn't necessarily mean nobody else was doing it, but it does mean that we had a very accurate and very specific assay.
And I think you'll find that the document on screen confirms that. So the document on screen is the Hemophilia Centre Directors Organisation AIDS Advisory document, drawn up after a meeting at Elstree on the 10th of December 1984. And we can see it says in point 2, tests for HTLV3 antibody are available for haemophiliacs via, and then it's Dr. Mortimer in Colindale, and then you. So that would be consistent with your recollection. Can we then just look at BART 40821? So this now moves us to the beginning of January of 1985. It's a meeting at the Middlesex Hospital Medical School on the 3rd of January between you, Dr. Mortimer and Dr. Krask. And just on the issue of testing, if we go to the second page, there's a heading recommendations, and it says this: it was therefore decided to propose to the UK Haemophilia Centre directors the following strategy for HTLV3 serology. And then paragraph A, all patients treated with factor 8 and factor 9 concentrate in UK haemophilia centres will be offered an antibody test for HTLV3 antibody within the period February to April 1985. And then B is family contact of patients. It was also hoped to offer HTLV3 antibody tests to relatives of patients who were found to be HTLV3 positive. And then there's a reference to shortage of reagents, and that would be better done by carrying out limited family studies to determine risk of spread of infection before offering a test to all relatives. And then C, follow-up of seropositive patients, and D, future HTLV3 antibody prevalence surveys. And then if we just go to the top of the next page, paragraph 2 says haemophilia centre directors would be offered the chance of testing as many of their patients as they wished within the next 3 months. Haemophilia centres will be asked to send sera to either Dr. Tedder or Dr. Mortimer for antibody testing, and then there's a reference to copies of the reports then being sent to Dr. Krask at PHL Manchester. So it would appear from this that you and Dr. Mortimer were effectively offering to the Haemophilia Centre directors testing of all patients with the expectation that would be between February and April 1985, and also some form of testing for family members. The inquiry's seen or heard evidence of, in relation to some haemophilia centres, of patients not being tested until later than that, so rather later than April 1985. So we've seen evidence of patients being tested in the second half of 85 and indeed even into 86. Do you know why that was the case? Was it difficulty in keeping up with the demand, or was it simply that haemophilia centre directors didn't always send the samples to you to ask you to test them?
No, I don't. I mean, I think it was an awfully unpleasant opening of an envelope and finding this virus where we'd hoped it wouldn't be. And, you know, all I can say, it was, and it still is devastating to look back on now, think of the harm which was going to arise from this. All I know is that we tried to comply with all the haemophilia centre directors' requirements, and at one stage we were doing an awful lot of testing, and I would say to you that the results of this should still be available. I left them behind at UCL when I left, and the files should be available to the inquiry through approach to virology at UCL.
So note the time. Obviously, we had the
Well, shall we go on till 4 o'clock?
yes.
Because normally we would have a half-hour break in the afternoon. We were scheduled to go on till 4:30 or thereabouts. If we go on now till 4 o'clock or thereabouts, we can have in one sense, we've already had our break. But
And then conclude for the afternoon
yes,
at around 4. Yes,
at a convenient time,
Yeah.
immediately or shortly after 4 o'clock.
certainly. So I just want to ask you then next a little about the testing of Dr. Ludlam's patients, which was a little earlier than this. So it was in the latter part of 1984. But before I do that, you referred earlier in your evidence today to an understanding about an IV drug use in Edinburgh. In 1983, 1984, do you recall there ever being any discussions about whether there were particular cities or locations within the UK, such as Edinburgh, which might, whether through international travel or IV drug use, become AIDS hotspots?
I don't, and I think that's evidenced by the surprise and the awful feeling of devastation with the results from the study we did with Chris Ludlam.
Do you recall, again, from this time, 83, 84, any contact with Dr. Ray Brettle in Edinburgh?
Well, the name rings a bell, but if you're asking me what the substance of the contact was, no, I'm afraid I can't at this distance.
And then, can you recollect how it was that you came to test Dr. Ludlam's patients? How, by whom, and on what basis was an approach made to you?
My belief, and I say this is a belief, this is not fact, this is just I feel, that it was recognized that the antibody assay that I had and which Philip was using at Colindale was of sufficient sensitivity and specificity to be able to be used to answer a really unpleasant situation of what is the prevalence of this infectious agent in a population. And I think Professor Ludlam realized that we had an assay and that I was amenable, obviously, to help anybody who required or wanted or would benefit from antibody testing. We made that a proposal, and he was one of the first people to say, "Can you come and help?" And we did.
You'd obviously tested a number of patients, as we saw in the Lancet study, so the whatever number it was, 180 or so haemophilia patients, for the purposes of that study. In terms of post the Lancet publication, was Dr. Ludlam, as far as you can recall, the first haemophilia centre director to ask you to test his patients, or do you not know?
At this distance, ma'am, I'm not sure. Certainly, his was one of the more poignant requests for help.
And do you have any knowledge of how those patients were selected? So you essentially you received a number of samples and performed the tests on them?
We would have been told, here is a selection of samples from haemophiliacs. Would you please tell us tell us the serological status of each individual?
And do you have any recollection of your understanding at the time of why Dr. Ludlam was approaching you in the autumn of '84?
I've thought about this considerably, and the trouble is when you start thinking about things from that distance, you're not quite sure whether you're following a pathway of novel thought or actually recording a memory. My feeling was that he would have wished to show how clean his population were from infection, because it was all local factor VIII. It wasn't imported from the US of A. And I think it was an aspiration to demonstrate cleanliness, and in fact, as we know, the opposite was found.
If we go to, there's an extract from your evidence to the Lindsay Tribunal. It's at PRSE 301668. And we can see it is an entitled excerpt from the transcript of the evidence of Professor Tedder to the Lindsay Tribunal, 9th of July 2001. And then you were asked about the testing of the Edinburgh patients, and your answer, 7 or 8 lines down from the top, is this. I'm going to pick it up 3 lines into the paragraph that begins, I think it was earlier than that. You say, I think it must have been in late autumn 84 when we did the first testing for him, because it was certainly, I will never forget. It was sitting in what used to be David Dane's room at the end of the corridor, looking out on an autumn sun, which was a very hot sort of Indian summer evening, which should have been a lovely evening. It was about 7:30, 8, going through this litany of positive, 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 and Christopher Ludlam obviously getting more and more pensive, and me feeling less and less kind as this evolution of damage done to a cohort evolved. That was the very early testing when he'd sent us cohorts of samples. And then you say this, which he already had a clinical suspicion that something had occurred, and that was the beginning of the evolution of knowledge on the Edinburgh cohort. So what you said to the Lindsay tribunal would appear to be slightly different from what you've just said to us in terms of your understanding of Dr. Ludlam's thinking. Here it was a sense that he had some form of suspicion that something had gone wrong.
I think I was probably wrong. I think the balance of people's views is that it was a desire to demonstrate that something hadn't happened, rather than what has happened. And that made it all the more devastating that it was an evolution of disaster unfolding rather than no disaster. And I will never forget that evening just talking with him, and it was frightful, truly frightful.
The inquirers had evidence about a meeting that was then held in December 1984, which information was in Edinburgh, which information was provided to patients, including those who had been tested. Did you have any involvement in that at all?
Not that I recall. I might have been asked as a virologist to give an opinion, I'm sure, but I do not recall specifically.
Just then going to go back to some issues relating to the development of the test, and before we break for the end of the day, just look at a handful of documents from late 1984. So if we start with PRSC 0003109, now, this is not a document that you would have seen at the time, Professor Tedder, because it's an internal Department of Health document. It's from Dr. Alison Smithers. The date is the 13th of August, 1984, and it's to Dr. Harris at the Department of Health. And we can see it's about setting up a working group to consider the introduction of a screening test for HTLV3 antibody. And then I just wanted to pick up what Dr. Smithers sets out in paragraph 2. You'll be aware of the recent development by Drs. Weiss and Tedder of a radio-immunoassay for HTLV3 antibody and the findings that the limited use of this test has revealed. It's proposed to extend the test to all blood donors at the North London Regional Transfusion Centre for a period of at least 3 months. And just pausing there, is that correct? Was that the intention, having done the testing on 1,000 there, that the plan was to then test all donors at North London?
I'm not sure what happened in the long run. Can you just reiterate your question again, ma'am? Because I was thinking about.
Yes, of course. It's whether Dr. Smithers' understanding as set out here was correct at that time. Leave aside whether it happened or not. Was it the case that the plan was to use the test, yours and Dr. Weiss's test, for all blood donors at the North London Centre for 3 months plus?
I'm not sure how much I would have supported that because of the danger of drawing people in on the basis of one centre having testing, therefore all centres having testing, that we're going to get our AIDS test at somewhere at Chelmsford, and it wasn't North London. I know there was an intention to run it at North London, and it would have had to have been run covertly for the danger of not wishing to draw people into the transfusion service to a centre where it wasn't being done. I'm not quite sure how to answer your question.
I think it may help if you read on the next sentence.
As the donor population for North London RTC is drawn from an area where the incidence of AIDS patients and possibly contacts is currently the highest in the UK, it is hoped to extend the screening test to at least 2 other RTCs.
And probably the next 2 sentences.
This, of course, depends on our ability to scale up production of reagents for the test using either the virus isolate from Dr. Gallo's laboratory or a UK isolate yet to be achieved. And then the suggestion is that that information will be used to base a policy about using the test more widely.
It describes it as a screening test in 3 centres.
Yes. Do you have any recollection of those plans?
Well, I know there was an intention to run at North London a period of testing there, and I think we could have. They were conversant with using radioimmunoassay at the time because the hepatitis B surface antigen test was an RIA, so an RIA for a competitive RIA would have been doable. I think the issue is whether this would have been safe to do testing in one centre without making sure that the other centres were aware or unaware that this was being done because of the danger of drawing people in who you, with the best will in the world, you didn't want to attract people from the risk groups on the basis of having a test when they may not have a test in one centre but in another centre.
And then the reference there to this depending on the ability to scale up production of reagents for the test. In terms of scaling up, your statement tells us, and this is a general question now rather than this specific point in time, your statement tells us that scaling up would require access to a sufficient volume of serum and a secure and steady supply of HIV culture supernatant.
Yes.
And is it right to understand that it was the latter that was more problematic than the former?
We had a great deal of voluntary support from young men in the risk groups to provide their plasma for this purpose. It was quite a remarkable option to have this support from, as I say, it would have been the beginning of the Terence Higgins Trust before it was called such. It would have been interesting to have to do this. It would have been requiring quite a lot of radioactivity handling, and that would have been containable. It was, looking back on it now, I'm not sure what the reason for any delay in this would have been. It could have been supply of the antigen, it could have been the radioimmunoassay, it could have been concern about not bringing people into the transfusion centre for testing until one had got coherent testing elsewhere. I have to apologise, but at this distance in time, I'm not sure which of those were the reason for delaying.
Well, if we perhaps just look at one further document, so if we move matters on to October 1984, to DHSC 0002323_009, this is another internal Department of Health document. It's from Dr. Smithers again. It's dated the 19th of October and it's to Dr. Alderslade. And we can see it's in response to a request from the Chief Medical Officer. So, again, not a document you'd have seen contemporaneously. The answer to question A from Dr. Smithers is this: only pilot studies have so far been carried out on blood donors at the North London Transfusion Centre, which have shown no evidence of antibody to HTLV3 in the 1,004 donors tested. Now, just pausing there, that is presumably a reference to the donors tested as part of the study that was reported in the Lancet, because the numbers match. Would that be right?
Yes.
And then it says the test is based on HTLV3 antigen acquired in the course of exchanges common to scientists between Dr. Gallo and Professor Weiss. Professor Weiss and Dr. Tedder, who together developed the test, did not feel that it was appropriate to greatly increase the amount of test reagent available without agreement from the US authorities to the increased use of the antigen. The antigen's been licensed to 5 US pharmaceutical companies for development of tests and a vaccine. Dr. Abrams wrote on the 10th of August to the Assistant Secretary for Health, that's in the US, requesting permission for the use of the US antigen in order to enable us to use the test more widely. We've had no reply. So before we look at the next paragraph, I think you say in your statement you don't think this is quite right.
What I'm questioning was what the pressure was on to have more antigen for which testing and where. The difficulty, and I think that the response from the American side was that it was given for research purposes only, not for quasi-commercial use. Now, whether you would consider expanding this seroprevalence study as quasi-commercial use, I think the Americans would, and we probably wouldn't consider that a commercial exercise. It's just we needed to have the data. Does that answer your question?
Yes, and then, and you've dealt with this in more detail in your statement. We don't need to put it up on the screen, but you comment on this in paragraph 186 of your statement. And then the second paragraph says this: in the meantime, the production of test reagent has been held up by the requirements of HSC, so that's Health and Safety Executive, and the activity of trade unionists. The laboratory at the Middlesex Hospital is expected to be finally commissioned by the end of this week. It's hoped that sufficient reagent will then be made available by the beginning of November to test all the blood donors at the North London Transfusion Centre. And then we have in brackets the reference to not wanting to make that too public for the reason you've already outlined. Do you have any recollection now of what was being said here about the HSC trade unionists?
Yes, I do. It was an entirely avoidable phenomenon. What had happened was the exhaust from the testing and from virus washing goes through, drawn out through a pump and put into a discard pot, and the discard pot has a vent, and the vent was meant to be connected to a pipe which sat inside a Class 1 cabinet. For reasons beyond my knowledge now, the safety pot was not put in the Class 1 cabinet but was left outside it. And the Health and Safety Executive, understandably, took extreme umbrage to this and declared it as a major exercise, a major contamination. Everybody's been infected. We eventually tested everybody, and nobody had been infected. But it was a salutary exercise of just how careful you've got to be to maintain people's aspirations of safety. No harm was done because the safety pot was there, but nevertheless, because it wasn't in the right place, we had I don't know what you would call it, a Category 3 style investigation and slapped wrists all round. It was an unpleasant exercise.
Sir, I think that's probably the right time to pause, because I've got a number of further documents to explore with Professor Tedder, just chronologically taking the story through into 85, but we can do that in the morning.
Yes, it is. The one question which arises out of this, there may be an unanswered question in some people's minds as to the activity of trade unionists. Is that the trade unions being concerned about the safety risk posed by the safety bottle, so associated with HSE, or is it something different?
It was the health and safety representatives in the department who were also trade unionists, but that just, I think that was coincidental that they were people who were particularly worried about working conditions and colleagues and safe, and therefore that incorporated safety. So it's no criticism of trades unionists. It was actually, I think, an overreaction, but understandable, by the health and safety executives who happened to be trades unionists. But that was coincidental.
And what excited this activity was the same incident you've just described.
Sorry,
what gave rise to this activity, this concern, was the same incident that
It was
the HSE
recognising that the
investigated.
safety bottle was not in the cabinet, it was outside the cabinet. The fact that it was collecting anything and there wasn't anything to collect anyway was nevertheless a slapped wrist and justifiable anxiety. And I've learnt that if you're going to put a bottle in the safety cabinet, you put it in the safety cabinet. I don't criticise. It was an error which was made but was not an accident.
Thank you. On that note, I think we'll end for the day and come back at 10 o'clock tomorrow, if you would. 10 o'clock.
Thank you, sir.